You must understand that the empath does not collapse like other people do. They do not yell. They do not fight openly. They do not announce war with loud words or dramatic scenes. No. When the empath finally reaches their limit, they disappear quietly. And that, my friends, is where the narcissist's deepest fear truly begins. This event, the silent departure of the soul who once reflected every wound and every insecurity of the narcissist, is not only psychological. It is symbolic. It is spiritual. It is what I have often called a transformation of the psyche, the rising of the true self from the prison of the false mask. And when this takes place, when the empath finally breaks inside, it is not anger that controls them. It is awareness, a painful but sacred realization that they have been trapped inside a story they never created, a stage play built from illusion and shadows. You see, the empath was never born only to absorb the suffering of others. They were born to notice, to feel deeply, yes, but also to look into the soul of another person. That gift, though beautiful in its origin, becomes dangerous when it is placed before someone who fears being truly seen. The narcissist, that fragile ruler made from mirrors and illusion, is terrified of being understood. Their whole identity depends on fantasy. They survive through projection, manipulation, control, and distortion. They do not truly love, they possess. They do not build connection, they seek domination. And so when the empath, who has been slowly drowning inside the narcissist's world of lies and emotional confusion, finally opens their eyes, something ancient wakes up inside them. I have watched this pattern repeat many times through stories, dreams, myths, and human behavior. The empath, often unaware of their own inner strength, becomes connected to the archetype of the wounded ruler, the narcissist. This is not simply romance. It is an unconscious agreement, a dance between opposites. The empath, the healer, believes they can calm the inner chaos of the narcissist. They mistake sensitivity for salvation. They attempt to rescue someone who does not truly want healing, only obedience and admiration. And this is where the danger begins. The empath slowly abandons themselves in the name of compassion. They begin to confuse boundaries with selfishness. They excuse manipulation because they believe it comes from pain. They justify cruelty by calling it hidden suffering. And little by little, they forget themselves. They forget what they need. They forget the center of their own being, the very place from which healing and truth are born. This forgetting is not harmless. It becomes a kind of spiritual death, a slow destruction of the soul. And it appears not only in the mind, through anxiety, sadness, exhaustion, and confusion, but also in the body, in dreams, and in the way the world begins to feel unreal. The empath starts to feel invisible inside their own life. They walk through familiar places and no longer recognize who they are. The mask they wear every day becomes heavier and heavier. But the soul always has a limit. And when that moment finally arrives, when the soul can no longer survive beneath the weight of suppression, it does not politely ask for permission to awaken. It rises suddenly, sometimes through illness, sometimes through dreams, sometimes through a strange burst of energy that whispers one powerful sentence inside the spirit, no more. This is the breaking point. But it is not an outward explosion. It is an inward collapse that becomes rebirth. The empath does not always scream or attack. Instead, they pull their energy back inward. They reclaim the pieces of themselves they once gave away. They begin descending into their own shadow to recover everything they sacrificed. The narcissist never notices this coming, because they never truly saw the empath as a complete human being. They saw a reflection, a tool, a source of validation and emotional supply. They believed the empath existed only for them. They became intoxicated by their own illusion. So when the empath finally disconnects emotionally, spiritually, and energetically, it feels as though a door has slammed shut. Suddenly, the narcissist is left alone with the one thing they fear most: themselves. There is a reason the narcissist is drawn toward the empath. It is not genuine love. It is not authentic connection. It is reflection. The narcissist sees inside the empath everything they buried long ago: the ability to feel, to grieve, to heal, to experience vulnerability. The empath becomes a reminder of the wound the narcissist has refused to face. But instead of confronting it, they exploit it. They attach the empath to their own damaged inner child and call that attachment love. And the empath, conditioned by endless ideas that praise sacrifice as virtue, accepts this suffering as destiny. They endure. They forgive repeatedly. They pray for change. And while doing this, they unknowingly strengthen the narcissist's illusion that they are the center of everything, that their pain matters more than anyone else's, that their wounds must always be worshipped. But once again, the soul has limits. The empath finally awakens not through hatred, but through realization. It is the same movement found in the process of individuation, a tearing apart of the false identity so the true self can rise. And this process is not graceful. It is painful, messy, frightening, and sacred all at once. The empath slowly begins to understand that what they once called compassion was not always pure compassion. Sometimes it was fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of feeling worthless unless they were useful to someone else. And so begins the deeper journey, a spiral downward into the unconscious mind. The empath begins reclaiming the shadow they denied for years: the anger, the grief, the desire for freedom, the need for self-respect. They stop rescuing everyone around them. They begin remembering themselves. They reclaim the voice inside that once whispered no, but was silenced by the endless need to appear kind and agreeable. And here a great reversal begins. The empath, who once depended on the narcissist's approval, becomes immune to it. They finally recognize the cycle. They name the manipulation. They break the spell. And in that exact moment, the narcissist panics, not because they truly miss the empath, but because the source of emotional supply is disappearing. The illusion is cracking apart. This moment is not merely psychological, it feels mythological. It is Persephone leaving the underworld. It is the forgotten goddess remembering her power. It is the sacred return of the self after years of exile. And often this awakening is accompanied by powerful dreams. Dreams of fire, floods, collapsing buildings, storms, rebirth, and transformation. The soul is cleansing itself from the false stories it was forced to live. So understand this clearly. When the empath finally breaks away, it is not failure. It is resurrection. It is a holy rebellion, a silent revolution that shakes the foundation of the narcissist's kingdom. And though the narcissist may scream, beg, manipulate, accuse, threaten, or project blame, it no longer changes anything, because the empath has finally heard the truth, not from the narcissist, but from within themselves. And so the empath walks away not through revenge, not through hatred, but through revelation. Their footsteps may be silent, yet the emotional wound left behind echoes like thunder inside the narcissist's soul. You must understand that when a spirit has spent too many years trapped inside false sacrifice, even its quiet exit becomes an act of protest. Now let us go deeper into what is truly happening beneath the surface of this connection: the archetypal forces, the ancient symbolism, and the invisible transformation taking place inside the unconscious mind when the empath breaks the silent agreement. We are no longer speaking only about two people. We are speaking about ancient patterns carried across generations like emotional curses. The empath carries within them the archetype of the wounded healer, the one who suffers deeply, and through that suffering gains the power to heal others. But this archetype contains a hidden danger. When the wounded healer does not yet recognize their own wounds, they focus entirely on saving others to avoid facing themselves. And the narcissist, skilled in illusion and emotional manipulation, becomes the perfect surface onto which the empath projects their unlived life. This is projection in its most seductive form. The empath does not project darkness. They project their light. They pour their love, potential, hope, and desire for wholeness into the narcissist's broken container, hoping that by healing another person, they too will finally feel seen and valued. But the narcissist is not a mirror of healing. They are a void created by an unhealed shadow. What the empath does not yet understand is that the narcissist does not truly desire healing. They desire admiration. They crave obedience rather than intimacy, power instead of connection. This dynamic creates a painful split inside the empath's psyche. Slowly, the unconscious begins sending warnings through dreams, through emotional exhaustion, through strange feelings of drowning or wandering endless hallways with no exit. These are not meaningless dreams. They are symbols. The soul is speaking through imagery. Water in these dreams often represents emotions that have become overwhelming and ignored. Endless corridors symbolize repetition, emotional loops, and patterns that imitate love while actually being rooted in trauma and fear. Eventually, the empath experiences what I call the revolt of the shadow. This is not ordinary rebellion. It is the return of the parts of the self that were exiled long ago: anger, truth, instinct, self-protection, and sacred rage. These emotions were buried because the empath learned early in life that being too emotional or too honest threatened peace and acceptance. But these buried forces do not return softly. They erupt like volcanoes after years of silence, and the empath, who always believed they must only be gentle and kind, becomes frightened by their own inner fire. But this fire is sacred. It is not evil. It is purification. It is the soul reclaiming its boundaries, reclaiming its right to exist fully, reclaiming its divine anger after years of being diminished and consumed. And in this moment, the empath finally understands something life-changing. They were never placed on this earth to disappear inside other people's suffering. They were meant to witness pain, not drown within it. The narcissist, when confronted by this awakening, often pulls away in fear. They accuse the empath of changing, becoming cold, distant, cruel, selfish, or uncaring. But the truth is, the empath is not becoming someone different. They are finally becoming whole. They are integrating the split parts of themselves. The divide between the false mask of endless kindness and the hidden truth inside them begins to disappear. The empath is no longer performing the role of healer at the cost of their own soul. This transformation is becoming real. The process is never straight or simple. It does not arrive gently. Very often, the empath feels guilt, shame, and even deep longing for the narcissist after walking away. Why does this happen? Because the narcissist did not only reflect pain, they reflected the wounded child living inside the empath. The hidden part that always felt unseen, unworthy, or impossible to love unless they were useful to someone. This inner child must be embraced, not condemned. The empath must now direct compassion inward toward themselves. And this becomes the hardest challenge of all. To truly love yourself after years of emotional abandonment. To forgive yourself for taking part in the illusion. To mourn not only the relationship itself, but also the dream of who the narcissist might have become. The psychic connection does not disappear through logic alone. It breaks through truth, and truth must be experienced inside the body, not only understood in the mind. That is why the empath often goes through exhaustion, trembling, or even physical sickness after leaving. The body begins releasing what the soul carried for far too many years. In dreams, the symbols slowly start changing. The empath may see bridges, doorways, or gates. They may dream about lions, serpents, or sacred rivers. These are not random images. They are initiations. The soul is guiding them back toward the world of archetypes, not as a captive, but as someone sovereign. The lion often symbolizes courage and the birth of the true self. The serpent represents transformation, the shedding of an old identity. The river symbolizes movement, renewal, and the return of inner life after emotional stagnation. When I speak about these things, I do not speak as someone who abandons science. I speak as someone who sees no separation between the psyche and symbols, between the neuron and the sacred. What you call healing, I call reintegration. What you call awakening, I call individuation. It is the sacred path from fragmentation back into wholeness. The empath, once torn between the need for love and the fear of loss, slowly roots themselves in something deeper, the self. Not the ego, not the mask they wore for the world, but the quiet, eternal center that always whispered beneath the noise. The self does not beg for love, it already is love. And from that place, the empath no longer enters relationships hoping to be rescued. They enter to share themselves honestly. Meanwhile, the narcissist, still trapped inside the maze of grandiosity, may attempt to return. They may send messages filled with guilt, praise, regret, or promises. But do not misunderstand this moment. It is not awakening. It is withdrawal. It is the panic that comes from losing emotional supply. The narcissist does not grieve the empath. They grieve the loss of control, admiration, and reflection. And here the empath must remember something important. To return to the cycle is to betray the self once again. Forgiveness may still exist. Compassion can still exist. But reunion is not always holy. Sometimes the purest form of love is distance. This boundary is not cruelty, it is protection. Not protection of the ego, but protection of the soul. The empath's light must now turn inward, illuminating the hidden places they avoided for years, the childhood wounds, the inherited beliefs about suffering and love, the shadow of the healer, the one who constantly gave others what they never gave themselves. This is the alchemical phase, the dissolving of the false self, and it leads toward the rebirth of the archetype, not as a victim, but as a mystic. The empath becomes someone who sees not only others, but themselves as well. They learn to speak their needs without apology and without shame. They learn to sit in solitude without searching for rescue. They learn to love without disappearing inside another person. And through this process, they become dangerous, not because they wish to harm anyone, but because they no longer participate in harmful patterns. The narcissist, if they ever awaken, must begin their own journey. But the empath is no longer the guide. They have stepped out of that role forever. They are no longer the caretaker inside another person's nightmare. They have become the sovereign inside their own dream. This is the snap. Not a collapse, but a breakthrough. Not an ending, but the birth of true consciousness. And now we must ask another question. What happens when this transformation spreads beyond the individual soul? Because when the empath transcends the wound, the psychic effect does not stop at the edge of their own healing. Something much larger begins moving inside the collective unconscious. You must never underestimate the archetypal power of such a rupture.
What happens inside one soul when they reclaim themselves from narcissistic possession sends waves outward like ripples across a sacred lake.
This is not only personal healing, it is mythic correction. I have long taught that the unconscious is not merely individual, it is collective. Beneath the surface of daily life, there exists a vast field of inherited memory, symbolic meaning, and ancient patterns that every human being participates in. So when the empath awakens, they do not simply leave behind a toxic relationship. They rise from a long ancestral line of silenced mystics, unseen caretakers, and scapegoated visionaries. They break a generational contract that whispered, "You must suffer so others can survive." This is not just poetry, it is psychogenealogical reality. The empath often carries the unresolved wounds of the entire family system. They become the emotional sponge, the psychic lightning rod, the one who senses what everyone else refuses to acknowledge. As children, they learn to read the emotional atmosphere before they even learn to read books. They survive by sensing danger, silence, tension, and unspoken expectations. So when they later encounter the narcissist, it is not simply coincidence, it is repetition. The narcissist embodies the same shadow the empath knew growing up. Emotional neglect hidden beneath authority. Manipulation disguised as affection. Yet this encounter, painful as it may be, is not punishment. It is a summons toward awakening. Inside the suffering lies initiation. The narcissist unknowingly becomes the dark priest of the empath's transformation, delivering them through pain toward the altar of the self. Only through being emotionally consumed does the empath finally remember their own hunger. Only through becoming invisible do they rediscover their own vision. Many ask what happens to the empath after this awakening. Do they trust again? Do they love again? Yes, but differently. They no longer search for fusion. They search for connection. They no longer give in order to feel needed. They give in order to be truly known. The energy of their soul changes completely. Where they once attracted people who needed rescuing, they now attract those who resonate with authenticity. Equals, mirrors, not empty voids demanding to be filled. This transformation cannot be faked. It is not created through affirmations or declarations. It is an energetic shift born from deep inner reconstruction. The empath, once divided into archetypal extremes such as victim, martyr, and savior, begins recovering those lost fragments. They integrate themselves. They sit with their rage without being destroyed by it. They sit with fear without running away. They learn to love themselves without conditions or demands. In the language of alchemy, this is the stage of sacred union. Not union with another person, but union within the self. Masculine and feminine energies, once divided and projected outward, begin harmonizing inside the psyche. The desperate need to be completed by someone else slowly disappears. And from this inner balance, the empath no longer walks the world as a seeker, they walk as a source. But let us return once more to the narcissist. What becomes of them in this equation? You must understand that the narcissist is not born evil. They are wounded, frozen within the trauma of a fractured ego. A child who learned that survival depended on domination, control, and avoidance of vulnerability. But do not mistake understanding for permission to return. Healing the narcissist is not the empath's responsibility. The empath's responsibility is to reclaim the lost part of themselves that once believed love must involve suffering in order to feel real. If the narcissist ever chooses healing, it can only happen through their own confrontation with emptiness. Yet most never do, because awakening from narcissism requires a symbolic death.
the death of the false self.
The death of the carefully constructed mask that protects the inner void. Very few are willing to walk through that fire. So instead they search for new mirrors, new empaths, new reflections to keep the illusion alive. This is why it becomes so important for the awakened empath to speak. Not necessarily to the narcissist, but to the world. To share what they have witnessed, not out of revenge, but out of liberation. Because many others are still asleep, still sacrificing themselves, still dying inside the wrong story. And the reborn empath becomes a torchbearer. They begin expressing themselves through symbols, art, writing, teaching, and truth. They become healers not because of a title, but because of their presence. Their words carry weight because they have suffered deeply. Their eyes recognize truth because they have wept in darkness. They no longer obsess over being liked. They devote themselves to being real. I have witnessed this transformation many times through patience, through dreams, and through ancient myths. The empath becomes the mystic. The survivor becomes the seer. The silent child becomes the oracle.